The B-17 pilot, who saw the Viet Cong's inhuman jungle feeding rituals. The jungle opened its mouth at 21:34 hours on November 8, 1967, and what crawled out defied every law of war, nature, and human decency I thought I understood. Through the oil-stained plexiglass of my B-17's nose section, 8,000 feet above the canopy that stretched like a living carpet beneath us, I watched 37 figures gather in a clearing that shouldn't have existed, moving in patterns that hurt to follow with human eyes. The heat distortion made everything shimmer like a fever dream, but I could see them clearly enough. Hunched silhouettes passing objects from hand to hand in a rhythm that matched no military procedure or cultural ceremony I'd ever witnessed. My co-pilot Johnson whispered, "Jesus Christ," into the intercom, and then went silent, and I knew he was seeing what I was seeing. The systematic dismemberment and consumption of something that had once walked upright, shared in a communal feeding that violated every principle of warfare Geneva had tried to codify. The jungle humidity fogged our windows despite the altitude, as if the earth itself was breathing up at us, and through that condensation I could make out the methodical precision of their movements, the way they arranged themselves in concentric circles, the deliberate care with which they divided their feast among the group. The B-17's engines droned their steady four-part harmony, the only familiar sound in a world that had suddenly become alien. And below us, the Viet Cong continued their ritual with an efficiency that spoke of practice, of tradition, of something learned and passed down through generations of jungle warfare. None of us spoke. None of us ever would. What we saw that night was never meant for human eyes. If you're here listening, stay with me and subscribe, because some memories should never die alone. To understand how I ended up above that nightmare, we need to go back to a farmhouse outside Dayton, Ohio, where a 10-year-old boy first heard the thunder of Wright Flyer engines testing at Wright-Patterson Field. My grandfather had been a mechanic for the Wright brothers, back when flying was still considered a form of controlled insanity, and he filled my childhood with stories about men who defied gravity and lived to tell about it. The B-17 Flying Fortress represented everything I thought aviation should be. Power, precision, the ability to carry American might anywhere in the world. When I first saw one banking over our cornfield in 1943, her aluminum skin catching the afternoon sun like a promise of victory, I knew that machine would define my life. I was 17 when I lied my way into the Army Air Corps, 18 when I earned my wings, and 19 when I learned that war was nothing like the recruitment posters suggested. Training was brutal poetry, breaking us down to essential components and rebuilding us as extensions of our aircraft. They taught us to think in formations, to breathe in oxygen percentages and engine temperatures, to navigate by stars and dead reckoning across oceans that stretched beyond the horizon of human comprehension. The B-17 became more than transportation. It was our cathedral in the sky, a 10-man crew bound together by physics and faith, carrying enough ordnance to level city blocks or enough supplies to sustain entire units for weeks. We learned to love the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that strategic bombing could shorten wars and save lives, that precision applied at altitude could accomplish what ground forces might need months to achieve. But nothing in training prepared us for Vietnam, where the rules changed daily and the enemy redefined the very nature of warfare. I arrived in country in February 1967, assigned to the 1st Air Commando Squadron operating modified B-17s for psychological warfare and supply missions deep into contested territory. The war planners had discovered that our older aircraft could fly lower and slower than jets, making them perfect for missions that required precision drop capabilities or extended loiter time over target areas. What they didn't tell us was that flying slow and low over Vietnam meant becoming intimate with a landscape that was actively trying to kill you, where every tree line could hide surface-to-air missiles and every village could transform from peaceful hamlet to enemy stronghold between sunrise and sunset. The jungle wasn't just terrain to cross. It was a living entity that swallowed aircraft, digested crews, and spat out wreckage so scattered that recovery teams often found nothing but empty parachutes hanging from branches like prayers that had gone unanswered. The heat was the first thing that got to you. A humid embrace that turned your flight suit into a second skin of sweat and misery, fogging instruments and making every breath feel like drowning in warm soup. Vietnam smelled like death, having an argument with life, rotting vegetation mixed with gun oil and fear sweat, a perfume that got into your aircraft and stayed there no matter how many hours you spent scrubbing the interior. The briefings painted simple pictures: support ground operations, deny enemy movement, conduct psychological warfare operations, but the reality was infinitely more complex. Intelligence reports spoke of an enemy that had adapted to total warfare in ways that Western military thinking couldn't comprehend, using tactics that blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, between military target and cultural site, between acceptable casualties and war crimes. The stories started filtering back through channels that didn't officially exist. Whispered conversations in mess halls and maintenance hangars about things that ground units were seeing in the deep jungle, away from established firebase perimeters and main supply routes. Patrols would report finding campsites that looked normal from a distance, but revealed disturbing details upon closer inspection: cooking fires that had burned human bones, food preparation areas where the remains suggested meals that violated every taboo of civilized warfare, evidence of consumption patterns that defied military necessity or cultural tradition. The Rock Marines were the most vocal about these discoveries, their experience with unconventional warfare in Korea having prepared them for psychological operations that went beyond standard military doctrine. They spoke of finding sites where enemy forces had engaged in feeding practices that served no nutritional purpose, rituals that seemed designed to terrorize captured personnel or demoralize pursuing forces. Medical officers started reporting patterns in recovered remains that couldn't be explained by conventional weapons or standard torture techniques. Bodies were being found with signs of systematic dismemberment that followed anatomical knowledge, cuts that suggested butchering experience, evidence of consumption that went beyond simple cannibalism into something more ritualized, more purposeful. The Vietnamese cultural specialists attached to our intelligence units insisted these practices weren't traditional, weren't part of any known ceremony or military custom, but represented something new, something the jungle war had created or awakened in fighters who had spent years living completely off the grid. The psychological warfare value was undeniable. The mere rumors of such practices were enough to reduce unit cohesion and increase desertion rates among South Vietnamese forces, proving that the enemy understood fear as a weapon more completely than we understood fear as a vulnerability. Our missions took us deeper into territory where map coordinates meant nothing and navigation relied on rivers and ridgelines that shifted with the seasons. The B-17 proved perfect for these operations, tough enough to absorb ground fire, stable enough for accurate supply drops, slow enough to conduct detailed reconnaissance of areas where faster aircraft couldn't loiter. But flying slow meant seeing everything, and what we saw in those hidden valleys and unmarked clearings challenged every assumption we held about the nature of the war we were fighting. Smoke would rise from jungle locations that showed no signs of habitation on aerial photographs. Movement would appear in patterns that suggested large-scale coordination, but left no trace of infrastructure. And always there was the feeling that we were being watched, evaluated, studied by an enemy that understood our capabilities better than we understood theirs. The mission brief on November 8th was routine on paper, Supply drop to a Special Forces A-team operating near the Cambodian border, followed by psychological warfare broadcasts to enemy forces in the region. What made it unusual was the intelligence addendum that mentioned cultural anomalies in the target area. Reports from previous overflights about gatherings that didn't fit standard enemy operational patterns. The briefing officer was evasive when pressed for details, referring to classified reports that suggested enemy forces in the region were engaging in practices that went beyond conventional psychological warfare into territory that military regulations didn't adequately address. The coordinates placed us over triple canopy jungle that hadn't appeared on maps until satellite photography revealed clearings that seemed to open and close, according to no pattern our analysts could identify. We approached the target area just after sunset, the jungle below us fading from green to black as shadows consumed the landscape and turned familiar terrain into an alien geography of darkness and uncertainty. The supply drop went smoothly, parachutes disappearing into the canopy like offerings fed to some hungry god, and we banked south to begin our psychological warfare mission. That's when Johnson spotted the fire. Not cooking fires or signal fires, but a controlled burn in a clearing that appeared on no map, flame patterns that suggested human arrangement rather than natural occurrence. We dropped to 5,000 feet for better visibility, then to 3,000 when the smoke patterns proved too complex to analyze from higher altitude, and finally to 2,000 feet when it became clear that what we were seeing required closer examination. The clearing was perfectly circular, carved from jungle so thick that creating it must have taken months of work. And in the center, 37 figures were arranged in concentric circles around a fire that burned without visible fuel source. At first glance, they looked like any other group of enemy fighters conducting a field operation, but as our aircraft passed overhead, their movements revealed a coordination that went beyond military discipline into something more primal, more ritualized. They were passing objects from hand to hand in a pattern that spiraled inward from the outer circle to the inner circle, each transfer accompanied by gestures that looked ceremonial, purposeful, sacred in their precision. The objects themselves were difficult to identify from our altitude, but their shape and the way they were handled suggested organic material. Pieces of something that had once been whole, components of a meal that was being shared according to rules we couldn't begin to understand. Johnson reached for the camera equipment, but I stopped him. Something about the scene below demanded witness rather than documentation, required human memory rather than mechanical recording. The figures moved with a synchronization that spoke of practice and tradition, each person knowing exactly when to receive, when to consume, when to pass along their portion of whatever they were sharing. The fire burned in colors that shouldn't exist in nature, blues and greens that suggested chemical additives or materials that burned differently than wood or paper. The smoke rose in patterns that defied wind direction, twisting and spiraling in ways that created shapes almost recognizable, almost meaningful, almost human in their configuration. And always there was the methodical precision of the feeding, the careful division of portions, the ritualized consumption that transformed simple eating into something approaching religious ceremony. What froze my blood wasn't the fact of their eating. Soldiers eat whatever they can find, and jungle warfare reduces human behavior to its most basic components. What terrified me was the obvious planning involved, the careful preparation of the site, the ceremonial nature of the consumption, the way each participant seemed to understand their role in a ritual that had been practiced before and would be practiced again. This wasn't survival cannibalism or battlefield opportunism. This was organized, systematic, traditional feeding that served purposes beyond nutrition, that communicated messages beyond the simple transmission of protein. The jungle around the clearing was moving in ways that suggested large numbers of observers, watchers who remained hidden, but whose presence could be felt like a weight in the darkness, an audience for a performance that required witnesses to achieve its full effect. The intercom crackled with nervous breathing and half-whispered prayers as the crew processed what we were seeing. Our tail gunner reported movement in the tree line that followed the rhythm of the ceremony, shadows that appeared and disappeared in synchronization with the passing of portions around the circle. The radio operator picked up transmissions in frequencies that shouldn't exist, voices speaking in dialects that our Vietnamese interpreters couldn't identify, communications that seemed to be describing our aircraft and crew in detail that suggested intimate knowledge of our mission and capabilities. The navigator reported compass variations that defied known magnetic declination, as if the clearing itself was generating some kind of field that distorted our instruments and challenged our ability to determine direction or distance. If you're still here, tell me where you're watching from. It helps the story stay alive. The feeding continued for 17 minutes by my watch, though time seemed to flow differently over that clearing. Seconds stretching into hours, while minutes collapsed into heartbeats. Each participant received their portion with reverence that bordered on worship, consuming their share with careful attention to every bite, every swallow, every moment of the communion they were sharing. The fire never diminished despite burning continuously. The smoke never dispersed despite the wind. And the jungle never stopped moving, despite the absence of any visible disturbance. When the last portion was consumed, the figures remained in their circles for what felt like an eternity, heads bowed in what might have been prayer or meditation or simple satisfaction at a ritual completed according to ancient requirements. Then, without signal or command that we could detect, they dispersed. Not scattered or fled, but dissolved back into the jungle with the same synchronized precision they had shown throughout the ceremony, disappearing into vegetation that seemed to welcome them home, swallowing them so completely that within minutes the clearing looked empty, abandoned, innocent of any human presence. Only the fire remained, burning its impossible colors in a perfect circle of flame that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. We climbed back to operational altitude and completed our mission in silence, each crew member locked in private contemplation of what we had witnessed, what we could never report, what we could never explain to anyone who hadn't been there to see it themselves. The flight back to base passed in a blur of routine navigation and mechanical procedures, but the normal rhythm of aircraft operations couldn't erase the memory of synchronized feeding, couldn't explain the careful division of portions, couldn't rationalize the ceremonial precision of consumption that served purposes beyond simple sustenance. The debriefing was surreal. We reported successful completion of supply and psychological warfare missions, described standard enemy movement and normal jungle conditions, filed routine after-action reports that mentioned nothing about clearings that shouldn't exist or rituals that defied military classification. The intelligence officers asked no questions about cultural anomalies or unusual enemy behavior, and we volunteered no information about ceremonies that had no place in official documentation. But the dreams started immediately. Night after night, I found myself back over that clearing, watching the spiral of sharing and consumption, trying to understand the purpose behind the precision, the meaning embedded in the methodology. The figures in the circles became familiar, their movements predictable, their ritual as comforting as it was terrifying. I began to recognize the careful attention they paid to portion control, the reverence they showed for each piece they consumed, the way the ceremony bound them together into something larger than individual soldiers or fighters. The jungle around them pulsed with life that seemed almost conscious, almost aware, almost collaborative in supporting and concealing their activities. Medical leave came 2 months later, officially for combat fatigue, but really because I had started talking in my sleep, describing ceremonies that couldn't be discussed and rituals that couldn't be acknowledged. The flight surgeon was kind but clear. Some memories were too dangerous to carry alone, too classified to share, too disturbing to process through normal psychological channels. The war was creating experiences that existing medical doctrine couldn't address, situations that required new approaches to trauma treatment and memory management. I was sent home with medications that suppressed dreams and instructions to avoid discussing specific mission details with anyone lacking appropriate security clearances. Years passed before I understood what I had witnessed that night over the jungle. The ceremony wasn't about food, it was about unity, about binding individual fighters into a collective identity that could survive anything the war threw at them. The careful division of portions represented the equal sharing of burden and responsibility. The ritualized consumption symbolized the absorption of strength from fallen enemies, and the synchronized movements demonstrated the kind of coordination that could only come from absolute trust and shared purpose. The Viet Cong had developed psychological warfare techniques that went far beyond propaganda or intimidation, creating rituals that transformed individual soldiers into components of a larger organism, a collective identity that could function as a single entity across vast distances and impossible terrain. The jungle had taught them things about survival that Western military doctrine couldn't comprehend, lessons about the relationship between individual identity and collective purpose that required abandoning conventional concepts of human behavior. What looked like cannibalism from our perspective was actually communion from theirs, a sacred sharing that created bonds stronger than any military unit cohesion our training could achieve. The ceremony I witnessed wasn't aberrant behavior, but advanced psychological technology, a method of creating soldier mystics who could endure any hardship because they carried their entire unit within their individual consciousness. The B-17 that carried us that night was retired from service in 1968, cut up for scrap metal that was probably recycled into civilian aircraft that never saw combat, never carried crews over landscapes where the impossible became routine. But somewhere in my garage, there's still a piece of plexiglass from our navigator's window. And sometimes, when the light hits it just right during late afternoon storms, I can see through it into that clearing where 37 figures share a meal that binds them together across time and space and death itself. The ritual continues in my memory, perfect in its precision, eternal in its purpose. Proof that the jungle teaches lessons about warfare that no military academy could ever comprehend. What we saw that night was supposed to be impossible, but the jungle proved us wrong about everything we thought we knew about human nature and the limits of military adaptation. Some wars are fought with weapons and tactics, others with rituals and ceremonies that transform individual fighters into something larger, something more resilient, something capable of surviving anything because they have learned to share the burden of survival itself. The clearing is probably gone now, reclaimed by vegetation and forgotten by maps, but the ceremony continues somewhere in the green darkness, binding new fighters into the ancient unity that made them invincible. If you want more stories from the sky, subscribe. These memories need witnesses.